What a week, right, Carlos? And it's not over yet. This is the election that never ends.
This may become a new way of life. Let's see what the 2020s have to offer.
That sound you hear is me banging my head on the desk, if that is going to become our new way of life.
You know, that is the whole reason for when Katty Met Carlos, to give him something different.
Let's jump in.
Let's do so.
I'm Katty K in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
And welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
our new podcast from the BBC World Service and OZY Media. It's not completely unprecedented, but it's certainly not normal. A president refusing to concede to a president-elect. Trump supporters are continuing to protest that the election was stolen from them.
As if the last 4 years weren't divisive enough, with families and neighbors split apart by their political beliefs, what's happening now doesn't look like being the healing balm that could bring this country together.
And let's not forget that Donald Trump increased his actual vote total in this election, with more than 70 million people supporting him. Just a few weeks back, we heard this stark message from one of the president's fans.
We are in the precipice of a civil war in this country. I hope that doesn't happen, but we're on the precipice of that. We're so divided. They can't stand us, and we can't stand them. There is no peace.
So how can this bitterly divided country be brought together again? We've been speaking to two senior figures from opposite sides of the political aisle to discuss just that.
We'll get to our second guest in a few minutes, but first up is the Reverend Al Sharpton. He's been a civil rights leader for decades, and in 2004, he ran for the Democratic Party's nomination for the U.S. president.
It is nice not to be talking to you at 6 o'clock in the morning for once.
Yeah, it is a time.
Reverend, how do you look at this election? As someone who has both run for president, who's advised people, what is your short summary on what happened in the election?
Well, I think that people came out and really responded to the fact that they feel Joe Biden is the reasonable alternative to what we've endured the last 4 years. I think that the pandemic, as well as some of the policies that Donald Trump represented, was a driving force. And I think that Joe Biden, given his ability to really show compassion and understanding and maturity, is what helped drive a lot of this election. And he's going to have a lot to work through. It's not going to be an easy task, but I think he can rise to the occasion as best as anyone.
Reverend, I know from having conversations with you before the election that you were hoping this result would be a definite repudiation of Donald Trump and Trumpism. But when you look at how many millions of Americans voted to re-elect President Trump, it wasn't that, was it?
Not at all. I think that Donald Trump, who many of us felt could have been a fluke, has proven he is not a fluke. Over 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, and you can't ignore that. That's the kind of country we live in.
How do you account for that then?
I think that the only way you can account for it is deal with reality. The reality is that there are large parts of this country that has no problem with the racism and the xenophobia and the homophobia and the misogyny of Donald Trump. I'm not saying that they're all racist and misogynist, but I am saying that they are willing to tolerate it. And so it means that you're going to have to deal with confronting the reality that many people are diametrically opposed to your point of view. And secondly, try to get some of them over to your side without losing the basic principles and policies that you believe in. And that's going to be a challenging needle to thread, but that's what we are left with.
Reverend, you know, one of the things that you have heard from a lot of analysts is what is happening with Trump voters is not only about economics, but is so strongly about race, and that point is being soft-shoed too much in kind of a detrimental way. Do you think that's the case? Do you think analysts and others are really struggling to have that conversation in its fullest?
I absolutely think they're avoiding to have that conversation. And I think that you cannot have a healing without having that conversation. You cannot talk about healing and not deal with the injury. And race is a large part of what we're dealing with here. In order to heal a wound, you've got to open up the womb. And that does not always appear pretty, but it's the only way we're going to get healing. You can't sew up the womb and leave the poison inside.
So, Reverend, you don't buy the argument that a lot of what drove those 70 million people to vote for Donald Trump was things like tax cuts, deregulation, the feeling that they were going to be more economically prosperous. You think that in the end it is about race?
I think at the end, race was a central issue. Some of those other issues, taxes and economic well-being, may have been a factor, but they were secondary factors. The fact is that even if you say that I'm dealing with what I think is economically feasible for my family, you're also saying, and I'm willing to tolerate racism if it's going to make me comfortable. Well, that's not much different than people in the Jim Crow days saying that, well, I don't join the Ku Klux Klan, but if it's going to keep the neighborhood safe, yeah, it's all right with me if you keep the blacks out. You cannot take race out of the scenario because they had to make a conscious decision that their comfort or their assumed comfort was at the expense of allowing racial policies and racial demagoguery to go forward. And that in itself is a race-based choice.
Do you think, Reverend, that the Democratic Party can win over working class white voters who have voted for Donald Trump twice in a row? Or do you think they just can't do it?
I think that there are possibilities that they can reach out and get some, but I think that they would be far more useful to go for the young voters that had never voted before, that did vote in higher numbers, and energizing black and brown voters. Because you don't want to abandon those that have been your addition that brought you to victory, trying to put all of your energy toward converting those that were proposed to you. Reach out to them, but not at the expense of those that brought you to victory.
Reverend, if I understood you right, the picture you lay out in terms of how the country can be brought together, and we're hearing a lot about unity. We're hearing it from Joe Biden. We're hearing a lot of people call for, can we get over these divisions? But the picture you lay out is pretty stark, that basically you think Democrats can't really win over white working class voters who have voted for Trump. And they certainly shouldn't try to do so at the expense of forsaking minority voters and African American voters. Is that what you're saying? Because that doesn't sound to me like it's possible to have a sense of unity and coming together then.
What I'm saying is you have to define what we mean by unity. Is unity that we get enough to move forward, or is unity that we have to get the majority or a large fraction of the Trump voters? I'm saying that you can get some of the Trump voters, but you can't get the majority of them without giving away what you ran on, what you say you believe in, and what a lot of your own supporters believe in. Because then you're not healing. You can't have unity by abandoning your side. You can only have unity by keeping your side, bringing it to the table, and hoping you can get some from the other side and build on that unity, which may start with 3/4 of the Trump side or even 4/5 of the Trump side staying where they are. But unity is not disunifying and becoming disjointed from your own base. Then who are you bringing to the table? You're only causing further tear on your side of it.
I want to ask you about the Latino vote. Was intriguing for so many people to see that President Trump outperformed what people expected, and not just in Florida, where there's a strong Cuban-American population, but in a number of other places, including Texas, which at one point Democrats thought they were going to win and put into the blue column. How do you see the president's strong performance with Latinos, and what does that mean for Joe Biden in the next administration?
I think that the Democratic Party has to deal with the fact that the Latino community, unlike the Black community, is not monolithic. So someone from Venezuela is different than someone from Puerto Rico, or someone from Mexico is different from someone from Cuba. Whereas in the Black American community, we're not a monolith, but we had a shared experience. We're the only ones in the country. There were laws against us based on who we were. Laws. It was against the law for us to go to certain schools or to use public accommodations. A much different kind of block of voters. And I think that they have to approach the Latino community based on what their nationalities are. Whereas in the Black community, when you talk racism and bigotry and racial profiling and policing, you're talking more to a block of voters that were united by what was against them by law, even though they may have cultural differences and some even coming from different backgrounds. They all face the same adversity.
Reverend, during the course of this year, I've heard you speaking, and there have been moments where you've sounded quite optimistic that the country can move forward, particularly at the height of some of the protests. Do you feel that now in the wake of the election? And would Donald Trump conceding make you more or less hopeful?
I think that I am as hopeful as I was because I never thought it would be an easy battle. I never, if I were to use boxing analogies, I never thought it would be a knockout. I'm glad we won by rounds. Now that we've won, I think is how you use the win to go forward on the issues that we have to go forward on, knowing that you have a significant portion of the electorate that does not agree. You have to keep going. If we look at the 60s, for example, when I was a kid and watched Dr. King and their movements before I was old enough to join, I don't know that we ever had the majority of Americans that wanted the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. But we were able to put together enough to the Senate and the Congress did it. And Everett Dirksen, who was a Republican, came and helped get the Civil Rights Act through. Sometimes you have to deal with step by step and not go for the knockout. So we didn't get the knockout. We won by rounds. And now as we go on to the next fights, I think we can keep picking up rounds. And I'm hopeful we can. Would I prefer the knockout? Yes, we didn't get it. But we are still in the winner's circle. We've got to use that circle and not dampen our own victory.
Okay, Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you very much for joining us.
Very glad to be with you. Thank you. Be safe.
So our next guest comes from the other side of the political aisle. John Kasich was the governor of Ohio until last year. He ran for the Republican nomination for U.S. president twice, in 2000 and 2016. He is not a fan of Donald Trump. Governor Kasich, it's pretty apparent coming out of this election that the country is more divided than it has been in a long time. Can you think of 2 or 3 ways that are concrete and practical and can be done to try to bring Americans to some sense of unity?
Well, I think, first of all, the bully pulpit of the White House, the presidency, is one that can really lend itself to communicating. Now, I know there are people who are the very strong Trump supporters are not going to pay much attention at this point to Joe Biden, but I think he cannot give up on communicating to the entire country. And I think what he did the other day when he said, he's president for all of America and not just for those who voted for him, I happen to think that's very, very effective language. Look, what has to happen now is, since the country is sort of split in half, I think that it is really important for Joe Biden and his team to take a look at those people who did not vote for him. And these are people who feel as though they've been ignored in some respects. They're worried about the culture. They're worried about a drift to the left. They're worried about defunding the police. And I think that Joe Biden needs to assure them about, the kind of person he is and keep at it. As for Republicans, they need to understand that Democrats have ideas and concerns about a lot of things, and instead of trying to characterize them in a very negative way, take a look at what they're really talking about, whether it's health care, whether it's community and police reform. And so I also think when we dig into various projects that we have in our community, whether it's feeding the hungry, whether it's getting together in the schools, I think there is a way for human beings, individuals, to come together and sort of shed their partisanship and begin to pay attention to what somebody else has to say. I've always believed change comes from the bottom up, so that if we are involved in solving a problem, all of us that we know is real in our communities, we begin to understand one another better. So I think it's the president. I think it's what we do at the community level. And ultimately, I think what we're going to see is a Joe Biden that's going to be forced to take moderate steps, and Republicans who I hope are going to say, okay, that's reasonable. So we don't have obstructionism from the Republicans, and we don't have overreach from the Democrats.
Governor, who do you think are the folks on the Republican side that Joe Biden can most likely work with on some of these contentious issues? Because you know that one of the challenges for President Obama when he had a Republican Senate was he often didn't find collaboration on that side. Where do you think Biden should turn first in 2021 if indeed Republicans maintain control of the Senate?
Well, I think he's got to talk to the people he knows, the people who he's had long relationships with. He needs to meet with a lot of these Republicans, and particularly ones that he's known for a long time. But if we were, for example, to take the environment, there is a growing consensus, even among those, well, there's still deniers out there, but there's a consensus something needs to be done. Are there things that can be done in a more moderate way to attract Republicans and Democrats? I think there is. But, let's work on that. Let's find out who's concerned about the environment. Let's figure out who's concerned about what we're going to do about health care. You have to come up with something that you think can pass and start working on people who have particularly interest in this. That is the way that I would go about doing it. But look, I've been up against a legislature that in my last year didn't want to pass my stuff. It was very frustrating. But you need to work as collaboratively and not lose your temper or lose perspective.
Governor, we had an interesting conversation with Reverend Al Sharpton, who obviously has run for president himself. And one of the things he said is that, similar to you, he wants to see healing, he wants to see unity, he wants to see people tackle difficult questions, but that he suspected that on some of the knottiest questions, whether it was around the police, systemic racism, maybe some of the other issues, that trying to go for 60-70% agreement is just unrealistic, and that there may be cases where Biden has to be a clear-eyed realist and has to accept that certain people won't come along and can't allow that fact to stop him from doing something decisive. And he made reference to some of the civil rights gains of the 60s. He said if we had waited around for there to be, supermajority consensus, we never would have gotten there. How do you hear that?
Well, I agree with Al Sharpton on that. But let's just talk for a second, and there may be a little different ways to do this. Let's talk about the issue of police and community. What I did in Ohio, you get your law enforcement people, you get your activists, and you get experts in a room. And you sit down and hammer out the reasonable things that should happen, the collection of data to make sure people aren't being discriminated against, the ability to have significant training. These are the kinds of things that can create a national model that can then be adopted. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to pass legislation, because I think the issue of police and community are critical. We don't want to have an African-American mom afraid to send her son to the store because something might happen to him. And we also don't want to have a policeman's family worried that he won't come home at night. There are ways to solve this. And in Ohio, we were very tense for a while. And as a result of this commission and the recommendations, we have not seen significant problems in the state of Ohio because we were able to come together. And it didn't mean that we had to pass a law. It meant that we had to have standards that have been successfully adopted by most of the police agencies in the state of Ohio. It's a good model to deal with this problem. But at the end of the day, you want to have some cooperation and you want to have some victories and some wins.
You remind me of a former mayor of Columbus, Ohio, who I'm sure you know, who once said to me, there aren't Republican potholes and there aren't Democratic streetlights. There are just potholes and streetlights.
I think that's true. Let's just take the internet. If we really want to help those people who live in the non-urban parts of America, we got to give them broadband. I mean, who would object to that? So we've got to come up with a program to allow them to have broadband. If the Democrats were smart, they'd realize that a lot of those people are people who are red. The Democrats could show them that they care.
Governor, let me ask you a little bit about President Trump and where we go from here. Clearly, the election has been called by most of the major networks. The president clearly has pushed back. What do you think happens from here? Are we going to have a extraordinarily contentious next 90 days between now and Inauguration Day? And what do you make of these recent moves around the Defense Department, where the president not only sacked the Secretary of Defense, but several other top folks and installed some loyalists? Is this something that we should be particularly worried about? Are you worried about this?
Well, what I don't want to have happen is that a significant percentage of the population not believing in the legitimate outcome of this election. And I've been extremely disappointed in Republicans who have said, oh, well, no, I don't think that this is decided. And I think part of it is related to the fact that if you're a Republican and you say it's over and Biden won and Trump lost, what about those people out there in your constituencies who are supporters of Trump? Do they become furious with you? Do you undermine yourself? To me, them's the breaks. Those people who can rise above it, those are what we call leaders. And right now, we're not seeing much leadership on the Republican side.
Governor, there has been suggestions that what Joe Biden needs to do now is set up a government of national unity, that we are in such a time of crisis dealing with the pandemic and the economy and all of the divisions we've been talking about. If the Biden campaign reached out to you and offered you a place in the cabinet, would you take it?
As you know, that's not really a fair question. But the answer is really, I'm not interested in moving to Washington. I've made it clear to them that if I could help them in some way on putting together a unity policy thing where I could work with them to do that, that's something that interests me. I want to be helpful to them, but let me also be clear. If they don't keep their word, I'll be highly critical of them because I think it's important that Joe's able to keep the word. And I stood up and endorsed him at a Democrat convention. I'm going to keep my eye on this.
Governor Kasich, thank you so very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And good luck to you all on this podcast.
Thank you, Governor. So what do you think, Carlos? We're heading into a nice time of unity and peace and harmony, or no?
I think the optimism of the American people will prevail, and I think we ultimately will get there. But it certainly is going to be rocky the next 90-plus days between here and inauguration. I think the president has signaled that not just in the last couple of days, but in the last 5+ years. But it was interesting, Katty. I enjoyed hearing Governor Kasich and Reverend Sharpton. I think they both actually had very thoughtful things to say about Biden's options going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Reverend Sharpton's comments about how basically the Democrats are not going to win over a big chunk of white, non-college educated voters who voted for Donald Trump twice in a row. I thought that was quite stark as an assessment of what the Democratic choices are right now. But I thought then the way that Governor Kasich framed it, basically agreeing with that, but the way to reach those people is, better schools, better broadband, which is chronically bad in rural America, that if you can deliver concrete things, you can actually bring people over to your side. And I think perhaps that's what Biden now needs to focus on, is if he wants to bring those people over, you've got to deliver something concrete.
The other thing, Katty, that I liked that Kasich brought up was the idea of encouraging some of the senators to build coalitions on their own. So maybe there's surprising groups that can come together. That certainly helped Bill Clinton in his first term around the question of Vietnam, when John Kerry on the Democratic side and John McCain on the Republican side essentially kind of hammered out a way forward without him and helped reduce the amount of dissent.
As I was sitting there on that very long election night, going through the exit polling, which may or may not be right, there are some questions about some of the exit polling, but when it asked people about issues, and a few things really struck me. One was that COVID actually was only the third most important issue for a majority of voters. But the second most important issue after the economy was racial injustice. And listening to Reverend Sharpton, who framed the divisions in this country very clearly around the issue of race. Do you think that's right? Do you think in the end, the bitterness and the gulfs that we see in the country are rock bottom about race and America's inability to deal with the issue of racial injustice?
I do, in short. It's a more nuanced answer than that. But yes, I think that you and I and many others now for centuries have heard that described as the original sin, the racial injustice, the description of African Americans in the Constitution as worth 3/5 of a person, and all that came with that kind of thinking and that kind of policy. But I think that there's a moment and opportunity here, and who would have thought that it'd be Joe Biden from Little Delaware that may have a chance? It would be too strong to say that he has an opportunity to be the Mandela of this nation, but he certainly has a LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the former president, who did so much of the civil rights work and was unexpected. People did not expect that he would be the one who would shepherd that kind of systemic change. Maybe Joe Biden is another surprising cutting-edge figure, and maybe that will be part of the intrigue and the excitement and the opportunity of the next 2 years.
And he has Kamala Harris, who is not white, by his side, which says something about his choices.
He does. And I think she will end up being, or at least will have the opportunity to be, very broadly helpful to him. And we've rarely seen vice presidents that have that level of impact. But I think she will have an opportunity to be, depending on how this plays out, one of the 4 or 5 most impactful vice presidents in American history. That's a lot to say this early on, but I think there's certainly the possibility for a variety of reasons.
I hope she's listening.
I bet she is. I bet she's looking for a little when Katty Met Carlos.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. Please listen again next week when we'll ask what the country can or should do to tackle climate change.